Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe my channel. Enjoy the listening. Human mechanic found an albino alien feline, infested with millions of Blackberry-like barnacles. The Zarian Belt was a graveyard of forgotten empires, stretching across the edge of the Terran Drift. It was a swirling minefield of debris, shattered frigates, lost colonies, and rusted-out stations that had been left behind by expansion waves centuries ago. It was where mechanics like Jace Mueller made their living, risking their ships and sometimes their lives for whatever tech could still be salvaged from the drifting bones of history. Jace had been alone out here for 10 years. No crew, no contract. Just a battered ship, a portable mechanic bay he'd welded together with salvaged walls, and a brain full of engineering tricks no university ever taught. It was a hard life, but he liked it that way, simple, quiet, until the day he heard crying from inside a wreck that should have been silent for centuries. He had been exploring the derelict remains of a vessel tagged as the Veritas Wayne, an old science carrier that had fallen off the registry during the third rim collapse. Jace wasn't expecting much, maybe some intact power cells, a few parts for his pulse compressors if he was lucky. The ship had been half buried in an asteroid, and whatever was left inside was bound to be dead or looted. But then he heard it, a sound, soft, a noise that didn't belong. He paused mid-step, his boots grinding against metal warped by years of pressure and exposure. The sound came again like a gasp, then a whimper, a living sound, Des. Small and cautious, Jace moved deeper into the corridor, sweeping his wrist torch across the walls. The cargo bay doors were sealed shut with oxidized crust, but they gave way under the careful buzz of his plasma cutter. Steam hissed out from the pressure change, and the scent of something rancid and wet struck him hard enough to make him gag. Something alive had been rotting in here. He stepped through. At first, he didn't see it. Just heaps of debris, crates half-melted by plasma fire, wall-mounted cryopods cracked open like eggshells, bio-cages torn apart from the inside. Then he saw movement under a pile of thermal mesh and loose conduit. Something twitched. He rushed forward, heart pounding. He pulled back the blanket of synthetic fabric and froze. It was a cub, a baby, no more than the size of a medium dog, breathing in weak, shallow pulses. Its fur was the color of white fire, so pale it almost glowed in the dim light. Though the light quickly turned to horror as Jace realized what had attached itself to the creature. Barnacles, alien parasites, thousands of them. They were embedded in the cub's skin like tumors, writhing, pulsing, glistening with slime. The creature's enormous, glassy eyes blinked up at him. It didn't snarl, it didn't cry. Again, it looked tired too, tired to hope. Jace dropped to his knees. "What the hell did they do to you?" he whispered, already pulling off his gloves. He lifted the cub into his arms as gently as he could. It didn't fight him, didn't resist. Its breathing was so faint he wasn't even sure it would survive the trip back to his ship. He didn't have a stasis cradle, just a medbed and a whole lot of instinct. He didn't stop to think about the risks. By the time he got back to his ship, the rig mother, a Frankenstein junker patched together with parts from 20 models, his hands were shaking. He laid the cub on the medbed and turned on every emergency override protocol he had. It didn't make sense. Why was a living, no, not just living, intelligent, locked in that ship, and why was it covered in parasites? Why hadn't someone come for it? The barnacles had to come off. They were digging into muscle, leaching into its veins. If Jace waited for a professional, it'd be too late. He grabbed his scalpel and began. He worked for 7 hours without stopping. He had to peel some of the barnacles off with surgical tweezers, each one twitching as it lost its grip. Some left behind nasty little suckers that had to be seared shut. Others shrieked when exposed to disinfectant foam. The whole time, the cub trembled, moaned, whimpered, but never once fought back. By the time he finished, the bed was soaked in antiseptic, blood, and barnacle husks, and the cub was still alive, barely. Jace sank to the floor, head in his hands, chest heaving. He hadn't cried in a long time. He didn't now, not exactly. But something broke open in him as he stared at that small, broken body, and he didn't know what it was, only that he couldn't let it die. When the cub finally woke, Jace had been asleep beside the medbed, slumped against the wall with a blanket over his legs and a diagnostic pad still clutched in his hands. He hadn't meant to sleep, but exhaustion had claimed him sometime after the 4th round of antibiotic injections and tissue seal sprays. The sound of movement woke him, not loud, just a soft shuffle, a claw on metal. He opened his eyes. The cub was sitting up, its head wobbling slightly, its legs shaky beneath its frame, but it was looking at him, really looking, with eyes that were no longer glassy or dull, but bright, alert, full of fear, curiosity, pain, something else too, something old. The creature tried to growl, it came out more like a hiss. Jace blinked at it. "Easy, little guy," the cub tensed, then made a weak sound, more confusion than aggression. "I'm not here to hurt you, Jay," he said slowly, raising his hands. "You're safe." "You're on my ship," it blinked again. The scent of antiseptic filled the air. The barnacles were gone, only scabs and healing wounds remained. Jace could see the faint pulse of its heartbeat in the exposed ribs. It was still emaciated, still healing, but it was alive. He reached for the bowl of nutrient gel he had prepared hours earlier. "I don't know what you eat," he muttered, "but this is what I've got." He placed it beside the bed and stepped back. The cub stared at the bowl for a long time. Then slowly it leaned forward and lapped once, then again, and then it devoured the whole thing in less than a minute. Jay smiled faintly. "Yeah, thought so." Afterward, the cub curled up in the thermal blankets he'd placed beside the bed. Jace sat beside it, watching the steady rhythm of its breathing. Days passed. He treated the wounds, cleaned the bedding, and fed it in small portions. It never tried to bite him, though it did snarl once when he got too close during an injection. He let it trust took time. He called it Aster after the flower that bloomed in the ruins of the earth in winter's bright white and fierce weeks. Later, Aster followed him to the engine room for the first time. He didn't walk normally. His steps were heavy, alien, but graceful in a way that was unmistakably feline. He sniffed at wires, tried to chew on a pipe. Jace gently swatted him with a wrench. "Don't touch the vent coil, you'll cook yourself." Aster swatted back. Jay stared at him, then laughed deep and full, the kind of laugh that hadn't left his throat in years. "You little monster." Aster chuffed low and proud, and somewhere in that cramped, oil-stained engine room, with sparks flickering overhead and stars spinning outside the viewport, a mechanic and a tiger cub began to become something neither of them had ever known: family. Jace woke to the sound of a plasma cutter falling off the wall rack. The crash was followed by a metallic skitter, a scrambling of claws on the grated floor, and then the unmistakable sound of a muffled yelp and a loud bang from the main corridor. He bolted upright in his cot, one boot on and one off, and half stumbled into the hallway, still clutching his spanner like a weapon. He found Aster halfway inside a wall panel. The albino tiger cub had grown alarmingly fast, already the size of a small mountain cat and getting stronger by the day. His sleek white fur had begun to develop faint silver streaks along the spine, and the wounds from the barnacle removal were now healed over with strange, flexible scars that shimmered in certain light. He was clearly no ordinary tiger. But this morning, Aster had decided to hunt something inside the walls. Jace watched him wriggle, hind legs kicking at the air, as his upper half disappeared into the conduit. "Aster," Jace groaned, "what are you doing?" Aster pulled back with a sharp jerk, dragging a man-angled maintenance drone from the wall like a prize catch. It sparked violently, its optics cracked, one of its arms still twitching. Aster dropped it at Jace's feet and sat down, proudly, chest puffed out, tail thumping. Jace stared at the drone, then it asked, You ate my cleaning butt?" Aster blinked, completely unfazed. Then he yawned, showing off a row of teeth that were already looking too large for a cub his size. Jace sighed and ran a hand down his face. "That thing had exactly one job." Later, after he'd cleaned the mess and secured the rest of the drones behind a locked panel, Jay sat with Aster in the engine room, watching him bat at a dangling cable as if it were the most entertaining thing in the universe. He tried to give the tiger a corner of the ship to call his own, converted a storage chamber into a sort of den with old blankets, thermal lamps, and synthetic turf. But Aster had claimed the engine room instead. Jace couldn't really blame him. The hum of the reactors was soothing, and the warm floor kept him cozy during long drifts between salvage sites. Still, Aster wasn't just lounging around. He was watching. He studied Jace's every move, every weld, every tool. When Jace dropped a bolt, Aster would swipe it back with surgical precision. When Jace cursed at a jammed valve, Aster would paw at the access hatch until he found the source of the pressure leak. His intelligence was growing faster than Jace could track, and it worried him. The barnacles, the accelerated healing, the strange way Aster's eyes seemed to shimmer with understanding. They weren't normal. Something had been done to him. But Jace couldn't dwell on it, not when every day brought more signs that Aster wasn't just recovering. He was thriving. The cub had a fire in him, wild and unshaped, and Jace would be damned if anyone came to put that fire out. Not that the galaxy would give them peace forever. A week later, Jace picked up a signal while scanning a derelict orbital station, encrypted faint, buried beneath old caldera debris. But inside, it was a fragment of a manifest. Biological specimen, hybrid tiger strain designation AX11. Jay stared at the data for a long time, then he turned and looked across the cargo bay, where Aster was dozing upside down in a heap of rags, snoring softly with one paw twitching in a dream. "AX11," he whispered. Aster stirred, blinked at him, then let out a half-growl of annoyance and rolled over. Jace didn't sleep much that night. The station was dead. Jace had powered up a docking arm just long enough to draw in auxiliary power, hopping to grab a few replacement filters and maybe a fresh scrubber core. Aster came along, padding silently beside him with an almost military precision. He was too big to carry now, nearly the size of a hover bike, lean and lethal with a grace that made Jace forget he'd ever been weak. They moved through the station's broken halls in silence. Dust floated in the artificial gravity like ghosts. The lights flickered weakly from faded solar backup panels that had been torn open. Blood trails, long dried to rust, trailed down one corridor into a medbay. They didn't enter. It had been a lab, the place red with medical equipment, biotanks, containment chambers, most shattered, a few still glowing softly with emergency power. Aster paced nervously in front of one sealed room, growling at the glass. Jace peered in. A mural had been scrawled on the wall in red ink or something worse. It wasn't words, it was a spiral made of tigers. Jace's stomach clenched. Then the terminal in the corner chirped, power restored. One last data packet appeared on the screen. Subject AX11, rejected specimen, failed bonding, transferred to Veritas Wayne for terminal observation. Jace's blood ran cold. They hadn't just abandoned Aster. They had tested him, rejected him, tossed him away like trash. Aster approached, nudging Jace's leg with his snout. His eyes weren't scared, just watchful. Jace reached down and placed a hand on his head. "You don't belong to them," he said, his voice shaking. "You never did." Aster growled again, low and soft, as if he agreed. Back on the rig mother, Jace initiated a full-engine tune-up and changed their transponder codes. No more salvage runs, no more drifting. Someone had tried to erase Aster. Now they might want him back. They weren't going to get him. Jace would keep him safe no matter what it took. It was 2 months later when Jace noticed the change. Not in the usual ways, not in Aster's already startling growth, his broadened shoulders, or the now golden sheen crawling along his albino fur. No, this change ran deeper, subtle but unmistakable. It was in how Aster moved, how he watched the stars, how he stared sometimes at his own reflection in the cockpit glass, like he was trying to remember something just out of reach. Jace had noticed it first when Aster refused his breakfast. That had never happened. The tiger, now taller than a grown man's waist and built like a walking tank, had never turned down a bowl of nutrient paste and protein cuts. But that morning he sat beside the bowl, unmoving, tail low, eyes distant. Jace crouched next to him, resting a hand on his back. The tiger didn't flinch. His fur felt warmer than usual. Jace blinked. It wasn't fever. Aster wasn't sick. He was burning, not physically, but something was alive inside him, something waking slowly like coals under a blanket of ash. Later that night, Jace opened the black box again, the encrypted file he'd yanked from the broken station's comm logs. He hadn't dared before, he hadn't wanted to know, but now he couldn't afford not to. He cracked the encryption manually, one painful line of code at a time. While Aster slept near the heat vents, the file decrypted into video. Low, gritty, fragmented footage of a laboratory somewhere deep inside a corporate testing facility. Jace watched as white cubs, dozens of them, were herded through sterile corridors. He saw injections, scans, barnacle exposure, then later trial logs. Barnacle fusion failed, neural bond unstable, candidate AX11 showing high aggression and unpredictable bonding traits will transfer to long-term exposure. Long-term exposure, that meant Veritas Wayne. Jaws leaned back from the terminal, chest hollow. They hadn't just thrown Aster away, they'd used him as a control to test survival alone, infested, forgotten. He rose and walked to where Aster was now curled in the dark, his head resting on a pile of dismantled coolant coils. The tiger's breathing was deep, steady, but even in sleep he twitched, as if dreams had become battlegrounds. Jay sat beside him, I don't know what they put in you, he whispered, but it's waking up, isn't it? Aster's tail thumped gently as if in agreement. You're not just an animal, you're something more. And Jace, who had once sworn he'd live his life fixing things and nothing else, found himself making a silent vow. Whatever Aster was becoming, he wouldn't face it alone. 2 days later, it started. They were drifting near a comet field when a flare of power surged through the ship's rear sensor arrays. Lights shorted, hull plates rattled. Jace scrambled into the engine room, expecting a core rupture, only to find the room glowing, not with heat but with light. Lines of gold and blue shimmered beneath his skin, pulsing in tandem with his heartbeat. His eyes were molten with fire, and his fur shimmered like liquid crystal. Hovering around his limbs, barely visible, were fragments of barnacles, not dead, not feeding. Jay stood frozen in the doorway as Aster slowly turned to face him. The tiger didn't growl, didn't move to attack. He simply stared, and when he opened his mouth, he spoke, not in human language, not in words, but in sound, in tones and frequencies, a resonance that made the air vibrate and the tools on the walls rattle in time. It hit Jace like a whisper that bypassed the ears entirely. I remember. And then the lights went out. When they returned, Aster had collapsed on the floor, breathing raggedly, his glow fading. Jace rushed to his side and held him until the trembling stopped. Whatever the corporations had done, whatever they'd buried in Aster's DNA, was no longer buried. It was rising, and Jace wasn't sure if he was raising a child or a force of nature. The first strike came without warning. Aster had barely recovered from the power surge when a trio of sleek black ships appeared outside the asteroid belt, moving with synchronized speed and impossible silence. They didn't respond to hails, they didn't flash warnings, they simply launched boarding harpoons. Jace was thrown across the cockpit as the rig mother lurched under impact, red lights flaring across the dash. Aster roared from the engine corridor, already charging toward the breach. Jace pulled himself upright and grabbed the emergency pulse rifle from under his seat. "We've got company," he growled into the comms, "and they're not here for spare parts." The first wave of attackers wasn't human. They moved like shadows, tall, multimed, clothed in polymer suits that bent light around them. Their weapons were organic, pulsing with black energy that made the metal walls hiss and blister. Jace held them at bay with suppressive fire, his back against the bulkhead, but it was Aster who turned the tide. He exploded into the fight with a fury that defied everything Jace thought he knew. No longer just a tiger, he moved with precision and coordination like a being trained for battle from birth. His claws tore through armor like foil. His barnacle fragments whipped around his body in a halo of sharpened defense, shielding him as he stabbed forward and sliced tendons. The attackers weren't prepared. They didn't expect him to fight back. By the time the second wave arrived, Jace and Aster had forced them into the corridor airlock. Jace hit the purge switch and they were gone. Silence returned, the ship trembled beneath his feet, but it held. Aster stood, chest heaving, blood not just splattered across his white fur. He looked at Jace, and in his eyes, Jace saw fear not for himself, but for Jace. "I'm not losing you," Jace whispered. Aster slowly padded forward and pressed his forehead to Jace's chest. Outside, the black ships disengaged, slipping away into the void like shadows retreating before dawn. They hadn't expected resistance. They'd come for a specimen, but what they'd found was a family, and now they knew what they were up against. So did Jace. He pulled up the nav map. "You want to chase ghosts?" he muttered. "Fine, let's see what happens when ghosts fight back." Aster growled, lurching beside him, and the stars ahead shivered. The rig mother drifted silently through the uncharted canyons of the Vrax Nebula, her engines humming low and concealed beneath a stealth blanket Jace had rigged from scavenged tech and more hope than science. The ambush had changed everything. Whoever they were, those beings who had boarded his ship, they weren't pirates. They didn't loot, they didn't even speak. They came for one thing and one thing only, Aster, and they nearly took him. Jace couldn't sleep. The fear still clawed at him in the dark. Not for himself, never for himself, but for the creature sleeping in the medbay's corner, wrapped in tangled cables and half a dozen thermal blankets, like some massive white beast pretending to be a house cat. Aster was healing, but not like before. He was changing, and every pulse of energy that shimmered through his stripes reminded Jace that the old rules of biology no longer applied. Aster stirred suddenly as if awakened by a presence Jace couldn't feel. Jace turned in his chair. The tiger's eyes glowed in the dim light. "You felt that too?" Jace asked quietly. Aster stood, No nod, no sound. He simply walked to the viewport and stared out into the swirling green of the nebula like it had whispered something just for him. That's when the beacon lit up, buried in the radiation haze. It was barely visible, a flickering pulse on an old military frequency, buried so deep it had probably gone unnoticed for decades. Jace blinked at the signal, unsure whether it was coincidence or fate. The coordinates were precise. A relay station abandoned, orbiting a planetoid with no name and less atmosphere, but someone had activated it. Someone had sent it. Aster turned from the window and growled once. Jace already had the nav coordinates locked in. Hours later, the station came into view. It was ugly, black, jagged, and partially collapsed, like a splinter of bone jutting from the planet's throat. Docking was tricky. Getting the airlocks to cycle took everything Jace had in backup batteries. When they finally got inside, the place greeted them with the cold breath of old secrets, dust, silence, and the faint hum of failing power systems. But someone had turned it on. Aster moved through the corridors like a ghost, leading the way, tail flicking with tension. They passed shattered terminals, fossilized blood stains, even a few long-dead corpses, some human, some definitely not. None were fresh. Then they found the message etched in steel, not holographic, not digital. RX-11, if you live, run just below it, in crude scratches. Jay stared, throat tight. Someone had tried to help. Someone inside the facility had defied their orders and released a SRA from that nightmare of a lab, and now they were dead. There was more. In a sealed archive chamber they managed to force open. They found data, real files, experimental records, bioweapon logs, Project Genesis. The artificial breeding of apex predators infused with barnacle symbiosis to create adaptable, rapidly mutating combat organisms. There were 12. Aster was the last. The rest had died, some from instability, others by design. Jace slumped against the wall, the truth sinking in like poison. He hadn't just rescued a wounded cub. He'd stolen the galaxy's last living weapon, and it didn't matter that Aster didn't want to be one, that he played with wiring like a kitten or curled up against the bulkhead to nap during hyperspace jumps. The people who made him didn't see a sun. They saw a mistake. Aster stared down at the data with a coldness Jace had never seen before, neither anger nor pain, only resolve. Jace looked up at him. "You want to end this, don't you?" Aster blinked once and Jace nodded. "Then let's find the ones who started it." They didn't leave the station quietly. Jay set a beacon flare, letting whoever was watching know it had been opened. Let them come, he thought, because the next time someone tries to claim Aster, they aren't going to be caught off guard. They're going to be ready. The stars looked different now, not because they'd moved, but because Jace had changed. He no longer viewed the universe as a mechanic, not entirely. He wasn't just looking for scrap, tools, or spare cores to sell. He was looking for answers and enemies. The map of the sky was now a battlefield, every signal a threat, every silent world a question with teeth behind it. He had gone from patching systems to plotting war paths, and Aster was no longer hiding who he was. Since the station, he'd changed again, faster reflexes, clearer intelligence. He began using the data pads with frightening skill, pulling up ship schematics, reading language files. One evening, Jace found a disassembled plasma rifle on the workbench, with the power converter cleaned and upgraded. The Tiger had rebuilt it better than Jace ever had. Jace didn't ask how, he just looked at Aster. "You going to take my job next?" Aster growled softly, amused. But the moment passed quickly because they had their target. The facility's data gave coordinates to an old vessel still in orbit around the asteroid moons of Talon's Reach. It had been the command ship of the Genesis program, now long abandoned. Supposedly, Jace didn't believe in coincidences. They reached the moon belt by nightfall. The ship was massive, floating in decayed orbit, its lights still dimly pulsed. Its nameplate was mostly rusted off, but part of it remained. The rest was unreadable. Jason Aster breached through a rear access vent. The hallways were silent, dead air, but something waited, something watching. They split up to cover more ground. Aster moved through the ducts like liquid shadow, while Jace followed the old security lines to the control room. He expected corpses. What he found was worse. Cryopods, dozens of them lined up in rows labeled with codes RX-12, RX-113, RX-14 and down clones, failures all dead, and at the end of the row, one pod still active. Inside was a creature almost identical to Aster. The same pale fur, same crystal barnacle fragments embedded in the muscle. But its eyes were wrong, black, hollow, and wide open. The pod opened with a hiss. Before Jace could react, the creature stepped out and roared. The fight tore through the ship like a firestorm. Jay scrambled for cover as Aster lunged from the ceiling, slamming into his twin like a meteor. The clone fought with mindless precision, fast, brutal, efficient, but Aster fought with something else: rage, memory, choice. They crashed through bulkheads, slammed into pillars, shredded metal with their claws. Jace tried to get to the ship systems to trigger a purge, but the fight was moving too fast. Then Aster did something Jace hadn't seen before. He glowed again. Not just his fur, but the barnacles, the stars. His whole body pulsed with heat and energy, the symbiotic implants erupting like blades of living fire. He roared and the clone was consumed. When the lights faded, Aster stood alone, chest heaving. The twin was gone, melted into ash and ruin. Jace stepped forward, blood pounding in his ears. Aster looked at him. Jace didn't speak. He just wrapped his arms around the massive white tiger and held him. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. The past was dead. Now came the reckoning. The NM, what remained of it, was gone. Jace set the reactors to overload and evacuated just before the explosion shattered the black hall into drifting fragments. Aster had watched from the viewport of the Rig Mother, his glowing eyes silent witnesses to the burning remains of his origin. There were no words spoken, none needed. The ship that had created him, tested him, and buried him in a frozen grave of forgotten science. It was ash, now memory erased by fire. But fire didn't kill the past, it just lit the way forward. Jace knew this was only the beginning. The destruction of the NM would not go unnoticed. The black ships that had attacked them weeks ago would be watching for the fallout, and wherever they were, they'd know that Aster had survived worse, that he had awakened. He wasn't a failed experiment anymore. He was the weapon they thought impossible, and now he was free. The first fleet arrived 3 days later. They came without warrant, descending from the rimward side of the Gravis belt. 3 ships, sleek and dark like the others, but heavier, this time faster, meant not for extraction or reconnaissance, but built for extermination. Jace had seen it in the scans. The second they broke stealth, they weren't here to retrieve Aster, they were here to erase him and him with it. Jace stood in the control room of the Rig Mother, fingers flying across controls, rerouting power from the auxiliary tanks to the primary shields. Aster stood behind him, silent and still, his muscles tight, tensed as if every instinct in his body already knew what was coming. "You don't have to do this," Jace muttered without looking back. "We can run, disappear again, you and me, find another scrap system to hide out till it's all just stories." Aster took a slow step forward and lowered his head until it rested gently against Jace's shoulder. The warmth of it said everything. They weren't running, not anymore. Jace closed his eyes for a second, then he tapped the C switch. "All right, you bastards," he whispered. "You want the tiger." He activated the weapon's grid, pulled power from the landing deck, and charged the modified plasma burst cannons. "Come and bleed for him." The first shot came from orbit. A shock wave screamed through the atmosphere and nearly split the canyon floor in two. Jace spun the Rig Mother away just in time, ducking behind the basalt cliff walls of the Dervin crater. The enemy ships followed, sleek and quiet, dodging through the crags like predators closing on prey, but they hadn't counted on Aster. He leapt from the cargo hatch as the first drone landed, moving with a blur of white flame and lightning. The barnacle fragments around his legs hardened mid-flight, lancing outward like spears. They struck the ground troops before they could even raise their rifles. Jace watched from the cockpit, jaw tight, fingers dancing through control triggers. He had jury-rigged a dozen weapon systems into the rocks. He turned the crater into a trap. With a deep breath, he hit the trigger. Explosions lit the sky. The drones were thrown into the air like leaves. Aster didn't slow. He tore through their lines like a creature of fury and grace, every step a thunderclap. The invaders had tech, numbers, firepower, but they didn't have heart. They didn't have him. By the time the second wave arrived, the ground was scorched black and littered with twisted metal. The third ship hung in orbit, unsure whether to land. Jace pushed his systems to the limit. He knew it would cost them the ship. He didn't care. He routed the last of the Corps' charge into the forward thrusters and launched the Rig Mother straight up toward the third vessel. Inside the cockpit, the alarm screamed, panels sparked, but the ship held as they neared the enemy cruiser. Jace activated the core rupture protocol. "You're not taking him," he growled through clenched teeth, and then the explosion bloomed from the wreckage, from the flames, from the black. Aster soared riding the shock wave, his body lit with golden energy, the barnacles shielding him from the inferno, landed in a crackling spiral of light, claws sinking into metal, fur strewn with ash. The last enemy ship turned and ran not from a tiger but from a god in the shape of one. Jace, barely conscious in the escape pod that had auto-ejected seconds before detonation, watched the stars spin above him and smiled. "I told you," he whispered, blood on his lip. "Nobody takes my boy." He woke up on a jungle moon days later, his body broken but alive, patched with nano-bandages and wrapped in an emergency field pod. The local colonists had found the pod crash site and pulled him free. They spoke of a creature, white and enormous, with golden eyes that had circled the wreckage until help came, then vanished into the forest. Jace didn't need to guess. Aster was out there. He spent a month recovering. His bones ached, his lungs burned when he walked too far. But every night he sat outside the infirmary and stared at the trees, waiting. He didn't wait long. One evening, just as the suns dipped behind the ridgeline, there was a crunch of leaves, and there he was. Aster stepped from the tree line, taller than ever, his body lean and scarred, his barnacle armor dormant, his eyes full of fire and peace. Jace stood breathless. "You came back, Asra." Aster padded forward and pressed his forehead gently to Jace's chest. "You always do." They never returned to space, not as scavengers, not as fugitives. They settled on that moon, built a small home with scrap and time. The locals came to know Aster not as a beast, but as a guardian, a protector of their lands, a legend with paws and lightning in his blood. And Jace, he finally stopped running, because what he had built with his hands was nothing compared to what he'd raised with his heart. A son not born from flesh but from fire. And together, they lived beneath stars that finally meant freedom.